The end of World War II did not simply signal the cessation of combat, but the beginning of an unprecedented period of economic and industrial upheaval. The conflict had left the globe scarred, yet the war economy had pushed many nations to expand their industrial infrastructure at a pace never before seen in human history. Central to this transformation were the temporary cities that had sprung up around wartime arms production. These cities, born out of urgency and necessity, were designed to fuel the war machine but were never meant to endure beyond the conflict they supported. With the cessation of hostilities, the fate of these transient hubs became a central issue for governments, industries, and local populations alike. The war had demanded that nations prioritize production, and nowhere was this more evident than in the rapid construction of temporary industrial complexes. In the United States alone, more than 60,000 factories had been established for the sole purpose of supporting the war effort. In the UK, similarly, entire cities were built around the production of munitions, tanks, and aircraft. These were not conventional cities. They were makeshift, often hastily constructed settlements designed to house workers and engineers. Some were built on sites that had been selected for their proximity to resources or rail links, while others were placed in strategic locations near military bases or ports. These locations became home to thousands of workers, often living in cramped, utilitarian housing. The factories themselves were sprawling complexes of assembly lines, warehouses, and workshops dedicated to the war effort. But the sudden cessation of hostilities brought a rapid shift in priorities. War production came to an abrupt halt, and the need for vast industrial output evaporated almost overnight. The decision of what to do with these temporary cities was not a simple one. Governments were faced with enormous logistical and economic challenges. The demand for military goods plummeted, and these cities, built around the machinery of war, suddenly found themselves redundant. The infrastructure that had supported the wartime economy now sat idle, and the workers who had populated these urban islands faced an uncertain future. In the United States, the government quickly began to scale down wartime production. The vast factories that had churned out planes, tanks, and munitions were either repurposed for peacetime industries or dismantled. However, the question of what to do with the cities that had sprung up around these factories remained. For many of these workers, the transition to a peacetime economy was not smooth. The shift from war production to civilian manufacturing created significant unemployment, and as factories closed down or scaled back, workers were left without jobs. The temporary cities that had been home to tens of thousands of people became increasingly empty as their residents moved on in search of new opportunities. For some, this meant relocation to other parts of the country. Many returned to their homes, while others moved to urban centers where the economy was expanding. In some cases, workers were retrained for new roles in peacetime industries, but these programs were far from universal. The economic pressures faced by individuals in these cities were compounded by a broader national struggle to transition from a war economy to a peacetime economy. The U.S. government, which had spent billions of dollars on wartime production, now had to contend with the challenge of converting that vast industrial base into civilian use. The rapid demobilization of the military and the subsequent downsizing of defense spending left many workers in limbo. In the UK, the situation was similarly precarious. During the war, Britain had established extensive systems of temporary housing and infrastructure around its munitions factories and military production sites. These wartime cities were often poorly constructed, with makeshift buildings and a lack of long-term planning. As the war ended, the government found itself in the midst of a severe housing crisis. The demand for wartime factories had disappeared, but the need for permanent housing had only grown. Yet, there was little political will to repurpose the temporary housing in the wartime cities for civilian use. In many cases, these structures were dismantled, and the workers who had lived there were relocated to different parts of the country. The process of dismantling or repurposing these cities was not uniform. In some places, temporary housing was converted into more permanent structures, but in others, entire communities were simply abandoned. The rush to return to a peacetime economy led to widespread dislocation. The machinery of war was no longer needed, and the workers who had built it were left behind. In places like the industrial heartlands of the Midlands and the north of England, Former wartime cities were left to decay, their infrastructure gradually crumbling. The scale of this challenge was not confined to the United States and the United Kingdom. Throughout Europe, nations faced the daunting task of addressing the remnants of the war economy. In Germany, for instance, the post-war period saw the dismantling of vast swathes of the industrial infrastructure built for the war effort. In the Soviet Union, many wartime cities were quickly repurposed for other uses, such as the construction of state-owned factories or military installations. But in many cases, entire cities were simply abandoned, left to deteriorate as economic pressures and the need for reconstruction pushed governments to focus their resources elsewhere. One of the most notable examples of this phenomenon was the fate of the city of Rüsselsheim in Germany. During the war, the city had been home to one of the largest aircraft factories in Europe, which produced fighter planes for the Luftwaffe. The factory complex, which had been expanded to meet the demands of the war, was heavily bombed by the Allies in 1944. Despite this, the city continued to operate as a center for arms production until the war ended. After the conflict, the city faced the challenge of transitioning from a military hub to a civilian economy. The factories were quickly dismantled, and the workforce was either disbanded or repurposed for peacetime industries. The city, once bustling with activity, became a shell of its former self, with large sections of its infrastructure abandoned and left to decay. In Japan, the aftermath of the war was marked by a similar process of industrial dismantling. Many of the temporary wartime cities built around munitions factories were either abandoned or repurposed for new uses. The Japanese government, under the oversight of the Allied occupation forces, was tasked with rebuilding the country's industrial base while also dealing with the aftermath of the war. This included the dismantling of war-related infrastructure and the relocation of workers to new industries. However, the country's economic challenges were compounded by the destruction of major cities, and many of the wartime industrial complexes were left to rot in the wake of the war. In the years following the war, the fate of these temporary wartime cities became a stark symbol of the massive shifts that had taken place during the conflict. Where once there had been a booming wartime economy, there were now empty factories and abandoned workers. The cities that had once served as the heart of the war effort were now little more than ghosts, reminders of a time when the world had been consumed by conflict. By the late 1940s, governments were beginning to grapple with the long-term consequences of the war's industrial mobilization. The temporary cities built to house the workers of war production were no longer sustainable. Many were simply abandoned, their buildings left to crumble. In some cases, the land was repurposed for agriculture or new industries, but for the most part, these cities were erased from the map, as if they had never existed. The broader implications of this mass abandonment were profound. The rapid dismantling of war production had left behind a landscape that was both physically and economically scarred. Former workers, many of whom had spent years working in the factories of wartime cities, now faced an uncertain future. The cities themselves had once been symbols of national effort, but now they were little more than empty shells. The question remained: what could be done with these remnants of a war that had cost millions of lives and had reshaped the world? And yet, the post-war fate of these cities was not simply a story of destruction. The process of repurposing or dismantling them was tied to broader national and global trends in reconstruction, economic recovery, and the painful transition from war to peace. The legacy of the wartime economy would not disappear overnight. But as the world moved further from the conflict, the cities built to support it would gradually fade into obscurity. The post-war period was a time of immense transition and reconstruction, and the fate of temporary wartime cities built around arms production would follow divergent paths across different nations. The world was entering a new era, but it was a time marked by uncertainty, hardship, and the weight of the conflict that had just ended. Governments, industries, and workers were forced to make decisions about what to do with the industrial infrastructure that had been so crucial during the war effort, yet was no longer relevant in a peacetime world. By the late 1940s, the economic pressures created by the war were beginning to become more apparent. The massive expenditure on military production had left economies drained, and the transition from war to peace was far from smooth. For the temporary wartime cities, the end of the war meant that their primary purpose had disappeared almost overnight. These cities, once brimming with life and purpose, now stood as symbols of a fleeting era. The immediate post-war years saw the swift abandonment, repurposing, or destruction of many of these sites, but the long-term impact on workers, economies, and landscapes would be felt for decades. In the United States, the transition to peacetime economy was marked by both an industrial conversion and a rapid return to civilian life. The federal government had made early decisions about dismantling or repurposing much of the wartime production infrastructure. Some of the cities that had sprung up around arms factories, especially those in industrialized regions like Michigan and Ohio, were partially repurposed for civilian manufacturing. The mass production techniques honed during the war were adapted to produce consumer goods, from automobiles to refrigerators, as the U.S. sought to reinvigorate its economy. However, this was not an automatic or seamless transition. For many workers, the change was less a return to normality and more a struggle to find new footing in a radically different economic landscape. While some wartime cities saw their industrial plants converted to civilian use, others were not so fortunate. The cities and towns built to support specific munitions production became obsolete once the war ended. This was particularly true in remote areas where factories had been constructed quickly and cheaply. These regions, having once been the focal point of wartime production, now became areas of economic stagnation. The rapid demobilization of military personnel, combined with a glut of war material on the market, created an overwhelming sense of economic uncertainty. In these forgotten corners of America, many of the temporary cities built for war were left to decay. The workers who had flooded these cities during the war also faced challenges. For many, returning to their pre-war lives was not a realistic option. Those who had moved to these cities for employment during the war were often unable to return to their homes or find new work. Wartime cities were typically not designed with long-term habitation in mind, and many workers had little in the way of savings or property. They were often forced to leave the temporary housing that had been hastily built for them and search for jobs elsewhere. In the UK, the situation was similarly complex. The British government faced a housing crisis that was exacerbated by the wartime expansion of industrial production. While much of the wartime manufacturing infrastructure was dismantled or repurposed, the cities created around munitions factories remained a pressing concern. Much like in the U.S., Britain's transition to a peacetime economy meant that the demand for war-related production vanished, and the cities that had sprung up in support of the war effort could no longer justify their existence. Yet, for many of these cities, abandonment was not immediate. Some were dismantled, but this was not always a smooth process. The British government sought to repurpose some of these sites for peacetime industries, particularly in the areas of manufacturing and civilian construction. However, this was often more of a logistical challenge than a successful solution. The housing built for wartime workers, for example, was often poor in quality, and the materials used were not suitable for long-term living. As a result, many of the workers who had been employed in these factories found themselves with little to return to once the factories closed or scaled back production. The empty, dilapidated cities stood as a reminder of a past that was rapidly fading. In Europe, the collapse of wartime economies created similar patterns of abandonment and repurposing. In Germany, where many of the temporary cities were designed to support military production, the immediate post-war period saw the dismantling of many factories and production sites. While the Allied occupation forces worked to dismantle Germany's war machine, many of the cities that had grown around these factories were left behind. The economic collapse following the war, compounded by the destruction of major infrastructure, meant that repurposing these cities for civilian use was not a realistic option in the short term. However, in some cases, temporary cities in Germany were repurposed for new uses. In regions of Germany that had been part of the Soviet occupation zone, many wartime factories were converted into facilities for military production for the Soviet Union. Some cities that had been built to support the German war effort were turned into industrial hubs supporting the reconstruction of Eastern Europe. Yet, even here, the focus was on rebuilding existing industries, rather than reusing the infrastructure that had been built during the war. The cities of the war years were seen as reminders of Germany's failed war machine, and the focus was on erasing their legacy rather than preserving or repurposing it. In the Soviet Union, The end of the war brought with it a different set of challenges. While the USSR had relied heavily on arms production and industry during the war, it had also built a network of temporary cities to support the war effort. Some of these cities were repurposed for new military-industrial complexes, while others were restructured for civilian use. However, like in other countries, the pressure to recover from the war and rebuild the economy was immense. The Soviet government, like others, prioritized the swift dismantling or conversion of wartime infrastructure. Where wartime cities had been built for a specific function, they were soon restructured for other purposes. But not all of the temporary cities built around wartime production were completely abandoned. Some experienced a slow rebirth. In places like France, wartime cities were partially repurposed for housing or for new factories, though these transformations were often gradual and incomplete. While the need for wartime production had evaporated, the process of rebuilding the nations of Western Europe required significant investment in infrastructure, including the repurposing of some wartime industrial complexes. But this was not a universal story. In many parts of Europe, especially those heavily impacted by the war, temporary cities were left to fall into ruin. The urban landscapes of wartime production became sites of decay and economic desperation, with little opportunity for revitalization.